Hey guys, in this video we're going to revisit our About Me page and change some features of the font. One thing that a lot of students have been asking about in class is, let's say we have our H1 tag and we want to center the code that we put, or the text that we put inside of the H1 tag. What we can do is we can use CSS to do this. So let's go to our H1 CSS selector and let's add one more line of style. We're going to say that the text should be aligned in the center. I'll save it and I'll refresh it. So now that text, instead of being left aligned, is aligned in the center. Of course, centering text isn't the only option. Let's see, with our H2 element, instead of having our text left aligned, like it usually is, let's move it to the right. So we'll go into the H2 CSS selector group, and we'll do text align right. Save it, refresh, and now all the text is aligned to the right. And it looks a little strange for our H2 element, but if you think about a normal website that might have like a login or a sign up or a log out link at the top, usually those are aligned to the right. So this is definitely a useful feature. When we look at our paragraph tags, we're going to see a more subtle text align effect. So maybe I'll do text align. I'm going to do justify. So let's see what this does to our page. I'll save it and refresh it. And what that does is it took all of our line and it made sure that if all the text in the line exactly fills the allowed width, or the allotted width. And so you have things where the spacing in between the letters is slightly larger here or slightly smaller here to make sure that it exactly fills that entire line. So just to contrast it, I'm going to change the paragraph back to the standard left align, and you can see how it changes things. So I'll save it and I'll refresh it. And now you can see that even though it's still left aligned, like it was with justify, it has a gap at the end. And the text is such that the spacing in between each of the words is equal. All right, so in addition to aligning our text, we can actually change some other features. So one of the features that I'd like to change is the sizing of our text. So I'm going to change this about me to be much larger. So I'm going to say that the font size for the H1 should be, let's say, 50 pixels. Save it and refresh it. And we're using pixels for measurement here. We could do something crazy like 50% even. And then it would size to only 50% of its allotted space. But that looks a little weird and it's hard to think about with percents. So I prefer to work with pixels when it comes to fonts. So 50 pixels, or if that's not large enough, 60 pixels. All right, H2. So for our H2 element, I think it looks pretty good with this size. I'm going to skip down to the paragraph. So with the paragraph, I want to resize this so that it's a little bit smaller. So maybe I'll try something like 10 pixels for the paragraph font size. Save it, refresh it. And now my paragraphs are a little too tiny, so actually maybe 14 pixels would be more suitable. Save it and refresh it. And that looks a little bit more familiar. That looks somewhat like the size you might have in a Google Doc or a Google Doc file or something like that. So I'm going to leave my paragraph at 14 pixels. In addition to changing the overall size, you can actually change some of the other features of the font more specifically. So one thing that you can do is, since our paragraph is so small, the font, maybe it would help to space these out vertically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the line height to, let's say, 24 pixels. I'll save it and refresh it. And what that means now is it creates an almost like a double spacing effect that you're familiar to from Google Docs or Microsoft Word. And we can actually look kind of in the details and calculate some stuff using the font size and line height. So because the font size is 14 pixels, this eye is 14 pixels tall. In addition to those 14 pixels, if I highlight it, you can see that there's some space above and some space below. So we have 14 pixels for the font size, and then the line height itself is 24 pixels. So what that means is that combining the top space and the bottom space, we have an extra 24 minus 14, 10 pixels. And I think it's evenly divided, so we have 5 pixels of extra space on top, 5 pixels of extra space on the bottom. So that would be one way to use line height. Let's see. In addition to changing the vertical distance for our line, we can change the horizontal distance in between letters. So we can use something like letter spacing. And let's see what 2 pixels will look like. So we refresh, and what this does is it spaces out the letters so that there's an extra 2 pixels from the default of space in between them. So you can do something crazy like 5 pixels, but it starts to get pretty hard to read as the letters get further and further spaced out here. So maybe in this case, going back to 1 pixel looks a little better. And even if I go to 0 pixels, I think this is interesting to see. There still is a little bit of spacing in between the letters, and so you can get an interesting effect where, let's say you want things to be really tight between the letters, you can actually make the letter spacing negative, and what that means is that it's 3 pixels smaller than what the spacing would normally be. So I'll save it and refresh it, and that creates a pretty hard to read effect because the spacing in between the letters is so small the letters themselves start to overlap. So maybe less dramatic but still pretty ugly would be -2 pixels. And I'm going to return to 1 pixel, just showing off kind of what features CSS gives us. So then, in addition to changing the vertical height and the horizontal height, there's one more way that I want to show you that we can transform text. So what we can do is we can actually change the casing, so uppercase or lowercase of our CSS style here, or of our H1. So I'm going to go into the H1, and I'm going to add an extra property, and that's going to be text transform. And I'm going to transform it so that all of the letters here are uppercase. And what that will do is, it's pretty hideous looking. Actually, I'm going to skip doing that on the H1. I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to do that on the H2 element. So let me just delete this, sorry. Oh, cool. So I go down to the H2 element and I'll do text transform uppercase. And it's going to make sure that all the letters here are uppercase, regardless of how I typed it in the HTML code. So this could be useful if you wanted to get some user input. Say you ask somebody for their name, and then you want to shout their name out in all caps because you're angry at them. But instead of all uppercase, you can actually do lowercase as well. And what that will do is it'll make sure that all the letters are lowercase. And I actually kind of like that for my H2. So I'm going to leave that. And there's one more option that I want to show you. So for my paragraph here, I can do a text transform. And instead of using uppercase or lowercase, I can use capitalize. And so what capitalize will do is it will go through and it will capitalize every word. So I have I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and every single word is capitalized as though it were the title of a book. And that might be useful if, say, you were getting a list of books that a user had read and you're not sure they're going to properly capitalize things before you display it. So then you can actually go through and capitalize it for them after they input that data. So I'm going to go back to not having capitalized here, save it, and refresh it, and it's back to looking normal. So these are just some of the ways that you can transform your text. So what we covered in this video was text align, which aligns the text horizontally, line height, letter spacing, overall font size, and transforming text so that we had all lowercase or all uppercase text independent of what the user typed in.